So it's a great pleasure to have a chance at last to talk seriously to David Good. David, I always start by saying, when and where were you born?
I was born in a small place that was then outside London in northwest Kent, a small place called Swanley. My parents had lived in London all their lives until they moved out there. They're from Bermondsey and Loughborough Junction, and they moved out just before I was born. So my sisters were born in Rowcross Street, Bermondsey, and I would have been born there if they hadn't moved out to this small town. It's just south of the Dartford Tunnel.
Right. And when?
I was born in 1952, late 52.
Okay, so very young, I'm going to say.
Can you repeat that?
And I ask people to talk a little bit about their family influences, usually going back to their grandparents. Though Sir John Gurdon went back to the Norman Conquest, but you don't need to do that. Can you tell me anything about your maternal or paternal grandparents?
Yes. On my mother's side, there's a rather sad repeated history on my mother's side, because her mother died when my mother was 5, and her mother had died when she was 5. So I never knew my maternal grandmother, although my maternal step-grandmother was a very kind, nice person. And my maternal grandfather was a railwayman, rather fortunate man in terms of his experience of the First War, because at age 18, despite being a protected profession, he signed up. So from August 1914 until late 1917, he served in the First War. He was invalided out once and went back. When he died at the age of 96, he still had an open wound in his left leg, a sinus that went all the way down. And there's an interesting story that connects down the family line, because the second time he was badly wounded, everybody else just left him for dead. And new American troops coming in saw this body twitching. Now, bodies twitch as they decay. And they didn't think he was decaying, so they pulled him out, got him in an American field hospital, and saved his life. So that would have been quite an interesting end to this story that would never have been told.
Indeed. So that's one side. What about the other?
The other side was, there's an interesting backdrop there, because on my father's side, my grandfather, that side, was badly gashed during the First War. He had been a trainee goldsmith before the war, but was unable to take that up after the war. And then he became, various points, he was bus conductor, he ran errands on the stock exchange, he had those sorts of jobs. Very quiet man. I always remember him just sitting in the corner smoking his pipe. And they lived in this little house right between the Bricklayers Arms goods depot and a tannery, I think it was. That was when London was really an industrial city then, and where they lived was right in the heart of that, in Bermondsey. But the family, it turned out, my brother-in-law discovered this recently, and it's funny how if you have a brother-in-law who's a genealogical sleuth, discovered that in fact the family on that side came from Cork in Ireland, and my paternal grandfather was born about a year or two after the family had left Cork to come to London. There's every reason to believe they left because it wasn't very safe there. So my father ended his life in Ireland. He lived the last 20 odd years of his life in Ireland. And at that point, because he didn't know about this history, he was seeking Irish citizenship via his second marriage to an Irish woman, and having lived there for 20 years. And he didn't know that actually he was simply entitled to it. The curious background there.
So coming down to your parents, tell me something about what they did and what their character and how they influenced you.
Oh, well, in a way, two very different people. To begin with, my mum, I was very much, for reasons I'll come to in a minute, I was very much closer to my mother than I was to my father. He was a fairly distant person. I'll come back to that in a minute. But both of them left school at, I think, 15. My mother worked in various factories. She then became a clippy on the buses. During the war, she was partly on the buses, and then she was partly a Land Army girl up in Lincolnshire. Then she didn't like being up there and much preferred to be with the bombs down in London with her friends. And she married my father in 41, and just after that, because he'd been in the army since the outbreak of war, because previously he was in the territorials, she married him just before he was shipped out to North Africa, and she didn't see him again until 1945. At which point they had 2 daughters after he came back from the war, and I shall we say the unexpected late arrival.
Yes, I was saying it's 10 years after they married you were born.
Yeah, 10, 11 years, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so in a funny kind of way, I was born into a family that already existed, because my 2 sisters are 6, 7 years older than me. And I mean, the whole family setup was very kind and supportive. So I've always suspected that my 2 sisters thought, now we have a real live doll. And I was very fond of my mother, and we were very close. But often, certainly as I was growing up, because when I was born, my sisters were first going to school. Then when I went to primary school, they went to secondary school. So we never overlapped in that sense. And I think a lot of the time I was alone with my mother. It was this, so a very close relationship formed. My father was, come to realise in later years, that his experience in the army and the fighting through the Western Desert, up through Italy, he ended the war in Austria, escorting White Russians back to Stalin's Russia. I think had a profound impact on him in a way that very few of us realised at the time. I mean, people didn't talk about it. Could have taken a cue from the impact of the First War on his father, but my maternal grandfather really went through some real horrors in the First World War, but then was just a robust, get on with life kind of man. He was always a rowdyman. It was quite a different character. So when my father he'd much prefer to be out in the garden. They'd moved out of London to be in the countryside. They had a small holding, they kept chickens, trying to create something that was a retreat from the horrors they'd seen. I mean, thinking back to my childhood days, those areas of basically Southwark, very heavily bombed in the war. And it was a retreat from that experience. So yes, I mean he was in the territorials before the war started. When the war started, he was 18. As the war started, all the territorials were made regulars and took over the posts that the regulars then left to go off to be in northern France.
What did he do?
He became a gunner, and it was quite an interesting role because he was in the light field artillery. So if you take, for example, the Battle of El Alamein, there was a big barrage, and of course the infantry then advanced following the sappers who were clearing the minefields. And then the kind of gun he fired, there were a little gun crew that would have the gun, a little truck, a limber to carry all the ammunition. And as the infantry advanced, they would follow up to provide the close infantry support, which is a fairly hazardous place to be.
And what did he do after the war? What was his profession, job?
Well, before the war, he had been a junior at the Junior Carlton Club, and he became a lifelong working class Tory. My mother, by contrast, was a lifelong socialist. So there was a real tension there. I mean, she was amongst the people demonstrating against Mosley and the fascists and such like. But after the war, he'd always been very good with numbers, and he'd always been somebody who took bets. And I didn't realise it until I went to university and learnt about these things, but basically he had a job working for a proper credit office bookmaker, but he also had a street pitch, which is actually a criminal activity in the late 1940s, early 1950s. According to stories from my mother, he got stung rather badly over certain sorts of things, and when you're in that world, you take the rough with the smooth. But when the 1960 Betting and Gaming Act came in that set up betting shops, he then was recruited to oversee the development of that for another bookmaker. And in South London, even then, it was a very, how should we say, disreputable profession. I remember hearing one thing from early on, when he first got a car, he was really annoyed that because he had that profession, he had to pay so much more on his car insurance. It was one of those professions that was seen as very dodgy. Very dodgy.
What is your earliest firm, concrete memory?
And
at what age?
I must have been about 4 or 5. If I think about it, I can probably track it to Christmas 1956, where I had as a present a very small teddy bear with a bright red bow on it around his collar. And I remember that. And there's sort of fragmented memories after that, various things around birthdays and things at school. When I was at school, school I went to was very old-fashioned school in various ways.
Primary school?
Primary school, yes. Yeah. It had very big classes. I mean, class numbers varied between 40 and 45. Lots of the kids, there was a traveller site near where we lived, so there was lots of traveller children. There was quite a lot of kids who were children of farm workers and horticultural workers. So at certain times of year, some of them would just go missing because they were out in the fields. I quite enjoyed it there because I very quickly learnt to read. And given the nature of the school, there were 2 or 3 of us that learnt to read quickly. Why, I don't know. I mean, there weren't very many books in the house, but I just picked it up very quickly. And we were always, having learnt to read quickly, we were delegated to teach other children to read, or learn how to read.
What was the school called?
It was called Birchwood County Primary School. One of the interesting things was it had a German headmistress, which, given the post-war era, her name was Miss Hafst. And I think she'd been a refugee before the war. Probably, part of that German community that exiled itself. For what reason, I never knew. But she was a very kindly presence.
Around that time, apart from obviously reading, did you have any passions or hobbies that were really important to you?
Well, given that we had quite a large garden, I was very fond of helping my father in the garden. I suppose in a way it was a way of getting close to him. But he was always doing things and looking after the chickens, and so he did lots of gardening, and my maternal grandfather was a great gardener. So that was another connection. Apart from that, and going out with other local kids, we had bikes. We'd go off. I mean, at that point, London was gradually creeping out, but it was still quite rural.
Yes.
It's not now.
No.
It's horribly built up now.
Yes. Sarah, my wife, was living in the equivalent area of North London, where it was still very rural, and she biked out into the country. Then you went on from that school where?
Oh, well, because at that time there was still the 11 plus. And out of this class of, I think, about 40, 45 kids, 2 of us passed the 11 plus.
Wow.
I think the standard rate at that point was about 1 in 4. In my school, it was about 1 in 20. Gives you some indication of what it was like. And I passed so well, in fact, the Kent County Council were willing to pay for me to go to Dulwich College. I won a scholarship. But my father's view was, no, he won't like that, he won't go there. So I went to the local grammar school, which was, it professed to have a very long history, dated its history back to the 15th century, but in fact had been refounded in the 19th century, and had all sorts of pretensions around the local sort of squirearchy, I suppose, of being a proper school of one sort and another. And then there were these London Overspill kids like me that turned up, which I think, they didn't really like.
What was it called?
It's called Dartford Grammar School.
Dartford Grammar School.
It was noted at the time because one of its former pupils, who they absolutely loathed at the time, but they adore now, was Mick Jagger.
Yes.
Of course, the kids thought he was a hero.
Yeah. Religion. Around the age of 14, 15, I was confirmed being C of E. What was your religious trajectory?
Well, when I was a child, it was interesting because my sisters always went to Sunday school. And at the point where I joined primary school, they went to secondary school. And at that point, they stopped going to Sunday school at the local church, and it was never suggested that I might. And I never requested it. So apart from going to things like funerals and christenings and weddings, somebody once put it to me, the hatched, matched and scratched services, no religious influence at all. My mother was quite religious in a low church kind of way. So she always taught me to be very respectful of religious things, but I think very strongly took the view that you should be observant of other people's attendance to the kind of formalities of the religion, like the music and the sermons and so forth, and very keen that we follow a certain kind of good life in those terms, but always act as if the spiritual bit was up to you.
Yeah.
Almost verging on a Quaker kind of view.
Yes. So the spiritual bit being up to you, how has it been?
Well, I suppose I was very heavily influenced by my mother. And lots of her creed was about how you treated other people. Now, of course, at school in those days, every morning you'd have assembly, both at primary school and secondary school. The only ones who weren't in assembly were those who were declared Catholics and declared Jews or declared Hindus. I don't think... we did have one Muslim boy in the school I was in. That was a time when there was, as you'll know, a lot of immigration from the subcontinent, and quite a few in the area I grew up in.
Would you describe yourself as an agnostic? Or...
Yes, I mean, I suppose agnostic. I've never been so arrogant as to think we have the answer to everything. And I do find the kind of protestations of folks like Richard Dawkins to sort of somewhat miss the point, because a number of people do have profound spiritual experiences which lead them to religion. Who am I to gainsay their experience? So I've always been very open-minded about it. I know when I go into the chapel and you see certain parts of the service, you can see how the music and various other aspects of the services, it really can raise the hairs on the back of your neck. So I suppose that open-minded, agnostic perhaps, never wishing to sort of tell other people they've made a mistake in. I've always had quite a dislike for those who go for the, shall we say, the strict religious pretensions that force something on somebody else. as you may not be no surprise to you.
Evangelical stuff.
Mm.
You mentioned the music that raises the hairs on your neck. Has music been important to you?
I've always liked some music, but I had absolutely zero musical education. The schools I went to, there was no option to do music. I mean, I think there were, going back to what I was saying about the secondary school, there's always a certain group of kids in the school who seemed to be involved in things that the rest of us were never invited to. So when I think back, in the first couple of years at school, I was very good at the mathematics we were doing. I'd regularly be vying for top of the class with another boy. And then, suddenly he seemed to be doing a lot better. I discovered much later on that his father ran the local Ford dealership. And it was arranged for him to have special education in mathematics outside, because clearly he was very good at mathematics, and things like that never came the way of individuals like myself, or indeed other kids from my kind of background.
Were there any teachers at school, the grammar school, who have influenced you and inspired
Yes,
you?
there was some really rather. I mean, I think we were lucky in the quality of some of the teachers we had. I can think of some mathematics and physics teachers and one English teacher who were really rather good, and in a funny kind of way they had their eye out not for drilling the curriculum into you, but helping you sort of develop. I mean, in those days I think we were very lucky in school, the way the curriculum was configured. So for example, in the sixth form, when you were doing physics, you just did lots of experiments, and then you would try to figure out why the experiment worked out that way, and thus the theory was introduced and the mathematics was introduced. And because we had such thoughtful, intelligent mathematics and physics teachers, it was a very rich educational experience, always appearing in terms of the ways in which they liked it when we were a bit awkward about the subject matter. So I remember one occasion when we were doing a class on on magnetic force fields and such like, and you sit around these big tables and all these little compasses to see the magnetic force field. And we knew this was coming up, so one of my mates had a steel ruler up his sleeve and distorted the magnetic field. This then led because the teacher, who was the supply teacher who was with us that time, call in the head and say, oh, you've got some magnetic anomaly here, must be something beneath the school. And the senior physics teacher looked at us all, his name was Mr. Matthews. He looked at us all and he went over to my friend and picked up his sleeve. And he thought it was a good thing. So I was very lucky in that respect.
Were there any other things that you were keen on, like sports or drama or local politics or anything else?
I like going fishing.
This was coarse fishing.
Yeah. Near where I lived, there was a lot of old clay pits and such like. Sort of going fishing, those were things that local kids did. Because when I'd been at primary school, all my friends there, none of them passed the 11 plus, so they all went off to the local secondary schools. Remember, you ever heard the comedian Mark Steele?
Yes, of course.
He came from Swanley. Remember hearing an interview with him about where he grew up, and he said, I only got one bit of advice: don't come from Swanley. But I had a very contented childhood in various ways. So while I can see why he said what he said, I never quite realised quite how it was until I left. I suppose that's true for all of us. Other things I did, well, I like tinkering with things. So very early on I got a bike. I was always improving it, fixing it. And as soon as I could, age 16, I got a motorbike and worked with friends on motorbikes. As soon as I got to 17, I've been during all of this, by the way, I've been working every weekend, every summer holiday in betting offices and betting shops.
Oh.
So by the time I was 17, by the time I was 16, I could happily buy myself a new motorbike with money I'd saved. By the time I was 17, I bought a kit car, which I made, and I bought other cars which I fixed up. So I suppose really what I was interested in was mechanics. It was rather funny because at the school I went to, there was clearly a little group of us they didn't like, because we had motorbikes, then we had cars, and we had girlfriends, which is not what you were meant to do. So when we got through to the sixth form, there's about 100 kids in the sixth form, and there were 6 of us they didn't make into prefix.
You were one of them.
Yeah, and of course they thought this was a mark of disgrace and disgust, and actually within the group of kids it was a mark of prestige. You were the cool ones that had the motorbikes that weren't prefects, that had leather jackets. It was quite funny.
You had to specialise for A level. What subjects did you?
Oh, all science subjects, science and mathematics.
Physics, chemistry, and mathematics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Further maths, applied maths, pure maths, that kind of thing. I mean, partly because, it sounds terrible to say, but A, I found it easy, and B, I mean, I was quite interested in history and literature. I used to read lots of novels and such like, but those poor lads had many more classes, and they ended up writing very long notes and lots of essays. I just couldn't be bothered. Why not take these courses that took less time? And you have all these free periods when you had to be studying, but you could do the homework in an hour or so. Then you go off. We had a common room. You go off and you could play cards, or you could bunk off.
So you went to Sussex University afterwards.
Yes, I mean I had, around that time, just as I was finishing my O levels. I mean that was an area when, if you were good at what you were doing, you did quite a few O levels early and then went on to various advanced things at age 16. Around that time, my parents' marriage started falling apart. There's a long story there, which I won't speak about now. But I did try the university I first went to on the advice of the school's career master. I had wanted to go to LSE. And the headmaster didn't think that people like me should go to LSE because he'd been there. It was the time of all the student rebellions and such like. And so he wrote this, I discovered later from the careers master I met many years later, he wrote this, a reference that said they absolutely in no way should take me. So I ended up being told to apply to, I mean, this is quite astonishing if I think about it now, to apply to do an accountancy degree. And they weren't sure I should go and do that. Maybe I should just go off and be an articled clerk in an accountancy firm. I was getting very good science A levels, clearly had a strong interest in mechanical things. Nobody thought to say, why don't you go off and do an engineering degree? Quite sort of disgraceful advice, if I think back on it. So anyway, there was then an interregnum that had this false start around an accountancy degree. And then 3 years later, I got very interested in psychology and psychiatry. My father had a breakdown. I got very interested in those sorts of things. And I worked for a while running betting shops.
This is after you left school?
Yeah. And I'd also worked for a while as a psychiatric nurse, which was very powerful in its sort of impact on you. Impact on me, I should say.
So what was the gap between school and university?
Oh, I started the degree at Sussex at age 21.
Well, not very long, 3 years.
But it was a very important 3 years. Like I say, working in the psychiatric hospital as a nurse was really quite impactful because I arrived to start the job. And in those days, even as an auxiliary, We did all sorts of things that even qualified nurses don't do now.
Mm.
So quite a remarkable experience in all sorts of ways, working with the patients. And it was in this very, I mean, it's the area of London. It was old workhouse hospital that had 4 wards in it that were, this is a period when experimenting with the idea that psychiatric wards could be part of a general hospital.
Mm.
So you're part of a general hospital looking after people who came from very impoverished circumstances. So in that area there were lots of the Peabody estates. I remember having lots of very depressed, unhappy young women brought in from these horrible conditions on these housing estates. We'd have lots of down and outs brought in from Camberwell Green. I mean, when you're at that age and you're sort of still getting to know the world. I used to have very long hair then, by the way, and a long beard. And then you're dealing with these down and outs that have been brought in from Camberwell Green. And by the way, I used to see them on the other side when I was working in betting shops on Camberwell Green, or in Brixton, or Catford, Lewisham, Peckham, those sorts of places. And then you take such a person and you realise quite what a dreadful state they're in. So they're usually brought in because they've taken too much of too many different things and they're very deranged. And you have to get them physically well before you can do anything else with them. When you have such a person coming, you cut their clothes off and you bathe them. You realise how the very first colour of the water is this kind of very browny, yellowy water. You're a young person aged 19 doing this. It's quite, teaches you quite a lot, actually.
It would do. So after this, what made you think that you would like to go to university, and why Sussex?
Well, I was looking for somewhere I could go and do a psychology degree that would put me on a pathway to become a clinical psychologist. Because having worked very closely with, I mean, I was very lucky. I mean, there were a number of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists on the ward who, I don't know, recognised something in me, and I got involved in all sorts of things. I mean, one thing that gave me a particular insight into probably where my father had suffered through the war was we had this man brought in who was deeply depressed, and I won't go into all the symptoms. But anyway, they used to use a process then called abreaction. They'd put somebody, this case using ether, into a, somewhat of a, I'm not quite sure how one would describe the state, but such that they would talk more freely. Anyway, it was a nice sunny day, and we were in this room with a Venetian blind, where the sunlight was coming through the Venetian blind, and the registrar who was doing this procedure wanted me to help him, so I went in, and this man suddenly started getting into some very bad memories, and he'd actually, and a little piece of the backstory, my father should have gone to the last group going into Singapore before it fell, and because he had appendicitis, he didn't. And say like 80% of his mates, I mean, it was very much a mates battalion in South London, some 80% of his mates were killed. So there's a terrible story there, but this man had been captured in Singapore and had been horribly tortured, and he had survived the war, quite surprisingly, and he thought I and the registrar were Japanese soldiers who were torturing him. And you're 19, 20-year-old, I think it was, something like that at the time. Witnessing that really pulls you up sharp. And it's dramatic experience in the moment. There were quite a few experiences like that, so I think it had a big impact on me, and that encouraged me to think of doing a psychology degree. I looked around. Sussex seemed like a very nice place to go. Brighton looked a bit like London by the sea. Sussex had a good reputation. And so I applied there. Now, history meant that the way things worked out was very different to what I planned at that point. But that was the thing that led me to a psychology degree.
So 3 years as an undergraduate there. Were there any teachers or fellow students who really influenced you?
Some teachers were really very, very important. Remember them very well, in fact. I should add that when I started, during that first year, they were planning this new degree that was to have its first entry group the following year. First advertised an entry group. They've been experimenting with the courses before that. But we were asked, they put out a call to students who were doing philosophy, psychology, and anthropology. Would you like to take as a key part of your course, because the course at Sussex was half in psychology, or 60% in psychology, and 40% in what they call contextual subjects. So courses like from Plato to NATO and those kind of grand survey courses. Would you prefer to do this other constituent who would take up that 40% of your time? Then you would take these additional courses in philosophy, linguistics, AI, those sorts of, and anthropology. And there's a group of about 25 of us who said, well, that sounds interesting. So we signed up for it. I mean, it turned out the curriculum they put on was something like a whole extra degree course because they didn't really know what they were doing. But there were some fabulously committed teachers who wanted to make this new degree work. And one of them was a man called, he was there, I think he was one of the first professors of artificial intelligence in the country.
Sloman? No, not Sloman.
Aaron was there. Yeah. He was in the philosophy department. Yeah. But the professor of AI was a man called Max Clues, who was famous at the time. It was a time when people were thinking much more about symbol manipulation as the story, and he worked on vision. And he was one who he was thinking about how you could apply grammatical ideas from Chomsky to the parsing of the visual world. And he came up with something called the Huffman-Clues line labeling system that actually saw these paradoxical figures like the Penrose triangle or the Necker cubes or such like, as actually being driven by ungrammatical configurations of line labeling. He was an incredibly thoughtful man. The course they set up, this day I wonder how they got away with it. So the first books we read on this course were Learning the Law by Glanville Williams, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life by Irving Goffman, Gombrich, the story, Art and Illusion. They got us to read some other Gombrich books. One by H.L.A. Hart, and some by John Austin.
A lot of law, yes.
Yes, and the view was, these are people who thought very hard about the structure of the world in a way that is really very important for how we think about these computational ideas. And then once you got into the course, various bits of philosophy were put your way, and then you had these courses. One of the courses in linguistics had another very important teacher there, Gerald Gazdar, who was working on natural language pragmatics. And that then opened the window into the thought that you could study these humanistic things and these very sort of humanistic aspects of psychology, but you could see a pathway to a very formal version. And with that background as a school student in mathematics and physics, the idea that you could treat seriously the humanistic elements in the context of a very well worked out and rigorous mathematical structure and linguistics, very attractive. And sort of at the same time doing these courses in these different ways and then being taught how to implement it by very good courses in programming languages like POP2, POP11, Prolog, those sorts of programming languages provide a very rich education. They also, we worked twice as hard as in prayers, but it was interesting, so it sort of pulled you on.
Did you mention that Jeff Hinton was there? Or?
He was there. He was there as a postdoc at the time. I knew him. I knew him a little bit. I was at various things because one of my good friends, Charlotte, who is in fact Ken Beryl's daughter, was a fellow undergraduate on the course. We're still friends now. I mean, she lives out at Wimpole, that kind of way. So she knew him then, but what he was doing was raising all sorts of issues that kind of surfaced in the course. And Max was very interesting in his observations on looking forward about what this would mean. I mean, other good teachers on the course, I mean, two very good ones. One was really quite, I thought she was a terrific teacher, was Maggie Bowden.
Oh yes, I've interviewed Maggie.
Have you?
Yeah.
Right. No, she was terrific because A, she was an excellent philosopher in thinking about the things we were doing and reaching out into what was then. I mean, most of what we did wasn't around very much by way of published literature, because it really wasn't very much. So you'd have technical reports from the MIT AI lab, or technical reports they'd written within the department. Plus, like I say, these very unusual things, but they're bringing them all together in a way that was very stimulating. And Maggie was very good because, I remember one occasion she was giving a talk to the Philosophical Society, as an undergraduate society, and I happened to be walking down and she was walking along, and so she was more than happy to talk to an undergraduate. She was very candid about how doing these things made her feel a little nervous, and so that she and indeed people like Aaron and Max and Gerald, and later on John Lyons came there.
Oh yes.
Were very open people. They were, I mean, we were the guinea pigs on the course. So how we were finding it was very important in how they shaped it and developed it, which made for a very rich education experience. If I hadn't been on that course, I might have ended up just doing psychology, going off being a clinical psychologist. But this, shall we say, turned my head.
Was there anything else that was happening at that time? Do you have love affairs, or do you?
Oh yes.
Get involved in student politics because or anything?
I didn't really get involved in student politics. Student politics was very active at Sussex at the time, but there, I mean, how shall I put it? One of my then girlfriends, I heard by the by that I and a good friend who came from Romford or Hornchurch, we were viewed as rough trade. So I didn't know I had an accent till I went there. And somebody said to me, "You come from London, don't you?" I said, "How do you tell?"
That's quite a posh place, Sussex.
Yes, it was very. It was quite funny because I and this friend, he crashed out rather sadly part way through. It all got a bit too much for him. But we were trying to, shall we say, raise ourselves up the social scale. We realised that most of the ones who were very active in politics were effectively mockneys. I remember one character I sort of knew reasonably well. He was part of CPGBML, Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, very much out there, and such like. And I saw him when we finished, and he was rather neatly dressed. He was about to drive off in a sports car, a nice Triumph Spitfire. So I said, "Oh, that's a bit of a surprise." He said, "Oh yeah, no, my dad bought it for me. I've got a job in the city."
Very British.
Made me very deeply cynical about these student politicians. I did get woven into one thing. Having had all this experience of working and running betting shops and knowing how to manage things, I got woven into being the treasurer of the Student Rag Week. So, recruited bands to appear, ran a lottery, looked after the finances, dealt with the charity commission, did all those sorts of things. And it's funny, it's just reminded me because all those experiences, when I got to the point of the retirement age, people worry about, do I have enough? It's a small part of the pension, but do you have enough national insurance contributions, enough years to get the full pension? I looked up my record, and you have to get up to 40 years. I have 47 years of contributions. Because every summer, lots of my friends would go off travelling and go abroad and such like. The day the term end at Christmas, at Easter, and for the summer, it would end on the Friday. On the Saturday, I'd be working in a betting shop until the Saturday before the term started. And yeah, and lots of my friends would either go travelling or they just claim the doll. And I never did any of that. It was a very sort of distinctive experience.
Certainly is. After your undergraduate degree, what did you do then?
Well, it was coming up to the end of the undergraduate degree. It was always a bit of a surprise to me that I did so well.
You got a first?
Yeah, I was topped by a long way. The highest first ever offered on this joint course. I mean, the one bit of it was, I got first in everything. But if you looked at me in the first couple of years, in various ways you would have seen me bumping along the bottom. Because I was very driven by what interested me. I think all those early childhood experiences of being in a school where you were something of an outlier, really what you did was you followed your nose. And you weren't really much given to doing what you were told. But in the final year, the way in which the examination system was set up really played to my strengths, because between that final year at Sussex, between Christmas and June, I wrote more submitted pieces, dissertations, takeaway exams, and plus we had all the regular kind of 3-hour sit-down exams. I ended up writing during that period because you had to submit something, and they were asking you quite tough things to do. So I remember on the linguistics takeaway exam, you collected one morning, you collected Monday lunchtime, you had to hand it in Friday lunchtime. Some really tough linguistics questions, but that suited me down to the ground. I could sit there and puzzle away, and in the course of doing all that, I wrote more for my undergraduate degree than I wrote for my PhD. So it was quite an interesting experience. It turned out, much to my surprise, apparently not to the people who were teaching me, I came top of the class by a very long way.
You mentioned something which probably applied then, which is that you didn't take notes, you just sat and listened.
Yeah, I couldn't take a note to save my
life.
life.
Have you got a photographic memory or something?
Well, I must have, but not photographic in the simple sense. But I would sit in lectures, and I'd see, I vaguely terrified at times, all my mates writing all stuff down. And I would sit there and I thought, well, I can't understand this person, I've got to listen. So I would just sit there trying to understand what the argument was, rather than take down notes. It actually stood me in very good stead.
Have you done that ever since?
Yeah.
So you don't take notes on anything?
Not really, no.
Interesting, but you can recall enough.
Yeah. And it seems I have a very good memory.
It seems you do. You haven't faltered so
Well, some
far.
of those early experiences, I remember when you could only work in betting shops after the age of 18, so that's when I started managing them. Before that, I had to work in the credit office. And, sometimes in the year, big public holidays like bank holidays and such like, there may be 10, 12 race meetings on, 6 to 8 meetings on the card. There'd be greyhound races. And you'd have to remember who was an on-runner, who came first, second, third, what the prices were, across this huge array of material, where you'd mark up a sheet, but basically if you spent time looking at the sheet, you occasionally did it to cross-check something, but you'd A, have to remember all that stuff, and B, you'd then at the same time you'd be doing this mental arithmetic. So you'd be presented, this person had 5 shilling each way Yankee on these 4 horses. 3 of them had come second and 1 had won. Calculate how much they were due. You had to do it very quickly. And so you couldn't be forever looking backwards and forwards and writing stuff down. You just had to do it. It's quite an interesting
training
regime, yeah.
Interesting.
So I think it shaped the way I approach things, and understanding mattered. Notes didn't.
Very interesting.
It's a very different educational and academic trajectory, I think.
Fascinating. So you did better than expected by some. What did you do?
Well, during that final year, I was encouraged to apply for PhD places. A bit of a surprise, actually, that I was encouraged to do that. I also applied for positions on clinical psychology courses, because that had been my original target. And I thought, well, I'll keep to that because that'd be a good thing to do. And I applied. Well, I applied to 3 places here: experimental psychology, Oxford, and Sussex. All 3 places offered me a place. 2 of them, Sussex and here, offered me money. And I would have done a computational linguistics PhD at Sussex, which I was very attracted by. A pretty completely different career now. But it was one of my teachers, Gerald Gazdar, who said, he gave a couple of very good pieces of advice about doing a PhD. He said, as much as I'd like you to stay here, it's probably very much more in your interest that you go somewhere else. Because you have a network of connections here. You always have those. You get experience of being other things taken for granted if you go elsewhere. The things you take for granted here aren't. And you make a new network. So I'd applied to Sussex, to Oxford and here. And he also said, think very hard about what your relationship would be like with your supervisor. Now at Oxford, the interview was pretty grim experience. My racing background comes to the fore. I remember it very well because it was Cheltenham Gold Cup day. And a horse called Davy Ladd won. There's a certain aspect to that. But it's that part again. At Oxford, I had to turn up at this corridor, sat outside the room, rather later than scheduled. 2 people called me in. They took great delight in being awkward. I think they didn't like the course I was doing at Sussex. It was quite clear they wanted to have at me for what I took to be good about that. But anyway, they offered me a place, so I obviously acquitted myself. They didn't offer me money. I didn't like them. And then I had an interview here in experimental psychology, which was not the obvious place, given what I wanted to do. I wanted to study human conversation, the kind of social psychology of that. But the person here in experimental psychology, I turned up, Brian Butterworth was his name. I turned up, he immediately invited me in. He said, oh, 1 cup of coffee? He went off and made me a coffee. He said, chat to one of my graduate students. I started chatting to him. Then he came back and we talked a bit more about what I was interested in, what he was interested in. And then we went for a walk around the town. We went for tea. And there was some European football match on the TV that evening, which I wanted to get back and see. And he said, well, why don't you sort of, catch a later train, come back to where I'm living and we can watch it there, have a bite to eat. And I thought, this is exactly what I want by way of a supervisor, somebody I can talk to. Because what I'd really appreciated about that education experience at Sussex was no one was telling me to hand in work, but everybody was willing to talk. There's often seminars, we didn't have things like the supervision system here, but in the nature of the course, doing lots of programming, you're always in the debugging room, drinking cups of coffee, faculty members were there. So I had the experience of working with people, and I felt I'd got a lot from those sorts of conversations. And what I wanted in a supervisor was not somebody said, well, have you done this first thing in your first experiment? Not that at all. I wanted somebody I could bounce ideas off. And Brian was terrific for that.
And the PhD was on what?
The title of it was Categories in the Study of Social Interaction. It was mostly about you could see the background from what I did as an undergraduate in this. Could you deploy ideas from ordinary language philosophy, particularly Austinian ideas around speech act categories? Could you use that to create a grammar of conversation? And in doing that, then looking very hard at when you got into certain problems in the formalisms you might use for that, could ideas from Gricean pragmatics help you solve those problems? And once you started realizing that that wasn't solving the problems, could you look to other dimensions of what was going on, i.e. characteristics of the speech stream and the non-verbal communication, to resolve that problem? Obviously far too much like you, but the examiners liked it. I read it before I was examined, and I was thinking, oh God, I won't give me a PhD for this. And lo and behold, they said, yeah, fine, do a few typos and we'll pass it. Which is very nice.
Were you at King's?
No, I was at Darwin.
You were at Darwin, yeah. Right.
One of the ironies there was I was looking for a college that I thought, oh yeah, all these Cambridge places. You know, again, think of that sort of Sussex experience, or indeed the grammar school experience, or indeed the primary school experience. I thought, well, you know, Darwin is all graduate students, plus point. Lots of people from overseas, plus point. When I turned up there, it seemed to be full of people who've now got this mentality of, I've made it to Cambridge, I'm now a Cambridge man at last. So again, I was sort of like an outlier.
Geoffrey Lloyd wasn't master by then.
No, Moses Finley was.
Moses Finley, yes, of course.
He was quite an interesting influence in a certain sort of way, because he would offer views about what academic life was. I remember in giving various talks when we were first there. And he was always fond of certain wicked asides of one sort. I remember one he said, well, you got two options in academic career. You can either read a lot or you can write a lot. Which I thought was a wonderful line.
It is.
But I have very little to do with the college, because if you're in something like the Department of Experimental Psychology, oh, and the starting point of that was, when I first arrived, it looked like they had a room for me, and because the paperwork didn't come through from the SSRC as it then was, you know, they just threw me out my room. So a week before I was due to arrive, I had no room. And then the paperwork turned up, and they managed to put me in a place they'd rented from Selwyn. And then during that first term, the SSRC went through one of its things. It wasn't going to pay college fees. So then they said to me, well, if SSRC is not going to pay college fees, you'll have to pay for them. I remember, before I even went to Sussex, my parents had broken up. So I had a full grant. I couldn't have gone unless I'd had a full grant and fees had been paid, because I was living alone with my mum. As I said, well, I've got no money. Right, where do I get the money from? Yeah, I said, I'll just have to leave. And so the first year of doing the PhD, there was this cloud. So I didn't feel very positive towards Darwin, I have to say. And the friends I had some very good friends in the house I shared, but we were always seen as somewhat sort of, not quite the right caliber, I think. I remember one of my friends, Paul, he was very active in the Anti-Nazi League. And he and a couple of other friends who were just doing 1 year's master's courses. I was the only one doing a PhD. They left, and I'd actually gone into Darwin for lunch with a couple of people one day. Then Bursa sat down next to me, and he was sort of chatting. He said, you lived in a house? I said, yeah, I lived there. He said, Paul Roberts lived there, didn't he? He said, yes, yeah, good friend. He said to me, wasn't some kind of Nazi, was he? I said, no, quite the opposite. He said, well, he found all this material there after he'd moved out. I said, no, it's Anti-Nazi League. It was... So I had very little to do with Darwin while I was there.
Yeah. So, when you finished the PhD, what happened? Did you come to King's or?
No, I finished the PhD. Remember, it was the time of the first Thatcher administration. I was finishing my PhD in 79-80 was the year I was finishing. So I suppose we should go in May 79, so that was the end of my second year of my PhD. It was clear things were going to get very much worse in all sorts of ways. And so halfway through my third year, being so inclined, I thought, well, got to have some money coming in, so I started applying for jobs. Nobody thought of saying, why don't you apply for a research fellowship? By that time, my supervisor had left Cambridge and gone off to a job at the UCL. I was basically just on my own. Was in touch with him from time to time, but basically left to my own devices. So I started looking through all the job listings, started applying for lots of jobs. And a temporary lectureship came up at Sussex in the old department I'd been in. It was a one-year temporary lectureship, but I was told the person we're appointing, we expect to get confirmation it will carry on after that year. So, we're looking to appoint somebody with that prospect. So I applied, was interviewed. They seemed to like me. They offered me the job, and I started. I actually started even before the third year was up on my PhD. Finished writing up while I was in that first year at Sussex. Went down there, and during the first year, I think it was something like the February, I was called into the Dean's office and said, well, we thought it would be this way when we appointed you, but it's not that way. So this job ends September the 30th this year. So I started applying like crazy all over the place, and a job, an assistant lectureship, came up in the old SPS faculty. And I applied.
SPS non-faculty.
Well, yes, it was just the SPS committee then. So interestingly, it was, having been in the old department I've been an undergraduate in, the post I was in was assigned to the department I've been a postgraduate in. And it's replacing, I don't know if you remember him, is replacing David Ingleby.
Of course, yes.
And there was all that to do over that. And funny enough, the person who'd held the position before me was Mary Sissons, who taught me when I was at Sussex, and neither of them had been upgraded. So I was sort of taken over a job where the track record had been not very promising. But anyway, I started there in, when was it? That must have been autumn 81, if I think about it.
Was Martin Richards there?
Oh, Martin was there, as was Colin Fraser. They were the two other psychologists in the department.
How did you get on with Martin?
I got on well with Martin, and I've got on well with him over the years. I think he wanted one of the other applicants to get the post. But it's reminded me now, the interview experience was, shall we say, quite robust. Part of it was they let the students loose on you as one of the candidates. And they saw that I'd been in the Department of Experimental Psychology. These are very radical SPS students. And they thought I must be some kind of rat runner or something. And kind of really quite unpleasant to me, actually. And anyway, they had one round of interviews for 4 people. 2 of us got through to the second day. We were kept overnight and stayed through to the second day. I was second in the room. And the person who was interviewed before me, who I think was probably the first choice, came out of the room. We sort of looked at each other, and she looked like she'd been run over by a bus. So I went into the room, and it was in the Provost Lodge at Newnham, and I'd never seen such a large interview committee, because it went like that, across there, and back down there, and there were even some members of the committee sitting just out of eyesight, just either side. And sort of questioning started about me and what I'd done. I won't go into the details because some of them are still around,
Mm.
but somebody launched this ferocious attack on me, and seeing the person who'd gone in before me, I thought, well, I can either try and be polite and kind, or I can treat this as a fisticuffs. I did the latter. I remember dear old John Barnes, he was in the room sitting over there, and I remember the layout very well actually. I remember where everybody was sitting. So John was sitting over there. Jeff Hawthorne was in the room as well, and John was sitting there, and I sort of basically launched back, and I started getting some of the formalisms that might be relevant to this argument. I just remember John Barnes laughing out loud. So I thought,
was Tony Giddens there?
I remember Tony being in the room at the time.
Yeah.
He was a little distant from SPS in those days.
Yeah.
In my early time there, he would obviously lecture a lot, but it was only during the sort of latter stage of my being there that you would see him there more and more, because that was, of course, before we had a chair of sociology and all of the things that developed around that.
So, I mean, there's so many people there that I would like to talk to you about on another occasion, but moving on to when did you come to King's?
I came to King's in 88.
88.
So that was during that was a funny process, because during the period from 81, 82 through to 88, because 88 was the start of the SPS first year.
Yeah.
And the year before that, I'd taken over as secretary of the SPS committee and helped Tony navigate all the things that gave us the first year in the subject, all the second year and third year reforms. And up until that point, I'd done a lot of work for a lot of colleges. And none of them, I felt, some of them were better than some others, but I think none of them had treated me very kindly. I won't go into all the colleges. There's 7 different colleges. I'd done a lot of work for them. I'd been paid for it as director of studies and such like. But it got to the point where we were going to have this first year, and obviously needed a full fellow and director of studies. And they all started being very nice to me. At that point, I had done absolutely nothing for King's. And I was at home. Funny enough, I was in the bath. And my wife's, I think it was Friday evening. And my wife brought in, we had a cordless phone. Very on the moment, we have a cordless phone. My wife said to me, somebody called Tess Atkins, the senior tutor at King's, is on the phone. She wants to talk to you. Do you mind talking to her? I said, well, just don't tell her I'm in the bath. So I had a chat, and she said, would you be interested in being a fellow here in SPS? I said, well, sounds like a very nice idea. She said, can you come in and have lunch with us and send me a CV and such like? So I did. And I came in and we had a very good conversation. And Nick McIntosh was there, Tony was there, John Dunn was there. John Barber was there. And we had a very good conversation. A short while later, she said, we'd like to offer you a fellowship. That was in early 88, and so 1st of October 88, I became a fellow. And I never regretted it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, it's very appropriate because this is Tess Atkins' room that we're doing the interview in.
It was my room at one point as well.
Your room at one point, and John Barber's room for some period. So it's all associated with these people. We've just got about 10 or 15 minutes left.
Yes, what is the time, by the way? Because I'm meant to be somewhere else at 12:30, so that's fine.
Oh, just 15 minutes. So there's so much more to talk about, but one way to structure it is to ask you if you had 3 ideas or pieces of work or articles or books that you really like to be remembered by, and you felt, well, your most important contributions. What would they be? Desert Island Discs of your own works.
There's certain things I've done, very odd pieces. I'd also add to it, one of the things I've done in the course of my career is I've created institutions and arrangements. And they don't get the same note in the academy. Yeah, I think they've had a profound effect on the academy. And some have failed because they were way ahead of their time. But others, I think, have persisted in quite useful ways. So let me give you some examples from both published work and other things. So one piece of work that's been widely cited, I really enjoyed doing, and really forced me to think in a different kind of way, and both these are cases like that, was when I started talking to Diego Gambetta. And he said, I'm very interested in trust, and it seems to be at the margins of everybody's discipline. Yeah, I think it ought to be the centre of something. He said, I've got people from philosophy, anthropology, politics, economics, but I'm looking for somebody who could give a psychological view on it. Now, having done so much work on the nature of human conversation and engagement between people, one of the things that comes up time and time again is that you can only really have a depth of understanding if you have a sense of mutuality. In a sense, that comes out of that whole line that comes from Grice. You can draw on all sorts of ideas from the psychological literature, which have largely been ignored, unfortunately. And you can also look at the dynamics of the interaction which support the connection between people. And so that would be one that I learnt a lot from. Other people have told me they really enjoyed reading and got a lot.
It came out as an edited volume, didn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And over the years, lots of people have asked me for copies of it, and so it's been widely cited. Less so now. There seems to be a reawakening in that way of thinking about trust. Second one, but again, I was invited to something, and it was by Esther Goody. She invited me to take part in a week-long workshop at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. It was like being an undergraduate again. She said, there's this interesting work on the evolution of intelligence that's all based around animal models. My question is, what happens if you put language into that story? She said, now I've got linguists like Steve Levinson, people from philosophy, from other anthropologists, sociologists. We're all going to come together in this workshop, and I want to have a psychologist like you. And the deal was, she would send you this big stack of readings, like being an undergraduate again, of all the existing animal literature. And I want your view of what happens if you put language into this story. Because this was the time when people would think about the anticipatory intelligence, AIP. I can't remember what the P stood for now, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And so that got me thinking about things I hadn't thought about for quite some time, but thinking about the ways in which, when it comes to engagement in conversation, how people are very poor at planning the future. That life lived through the windscreen is not life lived through the rearview mirror. And that if you start thinking about that, the chess model that seemed to dominate the work from people like, I'm forgetting their names now, the memory does stuff. The people at St Andrews who's got this whole field going. Anyway, about Machiavellian intelligence and such like. And I said, basically it was an argument that there's two fundamental things about humans engaged in this process. One is that there is no clear-cut point like making a chess move. If you think about anticipatory interactive planning, then as you say something, as the other party responds to you, what your move meant changes. So you have to think about what you're doing extended in space and time, extended over time. So what you do by way of response to the other party changes what they did, and then they decide if they've lived with that or not, likewise what you say. And so, in a funny kind of way, there are features of human cognition designed to cope with that problem. So I said there is no anticipation point in a simple way. Conversations are part of relationships, and these, if you look at what we do in conversation, both in the short term and the long term, there's always a thought about what the future might do. In a sense, I was trading some ideas from John Austin there about how when you think about statute law and then case law, anybody who writes a statute can never fully predict what the future will do by way of changing a context that changes what that original view was. And so I said, human intelligence evolved in that environment, and therefore it has properties which reflect that extended characteristic. So that was the second thing. Now, if you're thinking simply of academic...
What date was that?
That would have been 92.
Right.
Another thing which I did in more recent times, I'm not sure if I'm very tempted to go for this one because it was consequential. It's not a standard part of the published literature, but I worked very closely with a colleague. I mean, there's lots of publications that came out of it, but together we developed the when trainee clinicians get to the end of their clinical education, they get allocated to their what are now called foundation years. Used to be called their junior house officer years and then senior house officer years. Have a selection process, and they were concerned that recruiting merely on academic record. Having done that for many years, they decided, they being the foundation year program people and indeed the GMC, they wanted to have a view on essentially how can we actually tap into their other competencies. And so we developed a situational judgment test. Fiona Patterson and I. Fiona did a lot of the heavy lifting on this, I have to say. A situational judgment test is now used nationally. And so it was seen to be of great value because it helps. It's been misinterpreted in various ways. We set it up as a threshold test. So if you fall below the threshold, you're going to a foundation program, you almost certainly need to have further remedial education, coaching on these, not what they want to call non-cognitive skills. Because situational judgment tests, you present people with situations, you either get them to choose between options, rank order options, provide an interpretation, and this taps into something that standard examinations don't do. And that kind of built on, when I was running the program between here and MIT between 2000 and 2008, we put together a book, didn't get much note, but it has a lot of good stuff in it, called University Collaboration for Innovation. That was very much an intervention-focused program that wasn't very standardly academic, but we did lots of developmental work that was very important for things that people were doing educationally here. And many of the things we started then really took flight and really developed over the years. And I've done a lot of things like that. So by chairing committees.
You were on the general board too, weren't you?
Yeah, I did. I've done 12 years on the general board, 12 years on the council, 12 years on the audit committee, sat on the council of schools. But I've led lots of things that have changed things.
And you were running the Silk Roads project and the research project. You're a research project manager, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're a public citizen.
Yes, well, it's funny. I remember just thinking back now. It's funny how these conversations provoke memories. Thinking back to when I was first appointed in the days when you just got a letter that said, you always said, "Dear Good."
Yeah.
I remember the first time I got one of these, it was signed Vogan,
Yes.
Gerald Peter Vogan.
Yes.
But it was the time of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxies, or the universe, whatever it was. remember talking to John Barnes, and I said, well, I've got this one side of A4 in a letter which says, you've been appointed to this university office, go sign the book, follow statutes and ordinances. So what's your view on what I do? And it was a very brief conversation. I can truncate it in a certain way. I can make it more concise. After I walked away, I thought, what's John just said to me? He's basically said, look after your subject, look after your students, and look after the university. When you're a university employee, that was basically, in those days, the view.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've witnessed this in spades, I mean, much more than I.
Well, I got this letter in 1974 saying you've been appointed a university lecturer till the age of 2009 and subject to a renewal after 3 years. And I asked Jack Goody, the head, what I had to do, and he said, well, you give 40 lectures a year. When I became a reader, it said nothing. I mean, it just said you are appointed to the university an ad hominem reader in 1986. When I became professor, ad hominem professor, only the second in my discipline after Edmund Leach, 1991, it just said your duties are to be available to students for 1 hour a week at some appointed hour and place. So I have visions of going to the top of St Mary's Church at midnight and saying I'm available. Anyway, those were the days, and on that cheery note, I think we better let you get off.
Yes.
I hope we didn't miss anything that you particularly like to talk about. Sometimes people say I should have mentioned my family.
It's provoked all sorts of memories.
My family, for example, or children, wives.
I've probably had a very different career to many people, partly because when I got tenure, I thought, well, now I just have license to do what I think is right. As I got involved, I've done a lot of education innovations here. I've worked on lots of external projects. I've currently got one that's beginning, possibly, these are two very much in a twinkle in the eye, but helping a big urban development in Belfast on the Waterside site, and another one with colleagues in Dakar who are looking to develop a bioscience cluster there. And really what happened to my career was, because I had such an interest in such interventions, I got very heavily involved in the psychology of design. There's a whole interesting other part of my career that we've not talked about, which is, I'm an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Art. So I've worked a lot with designers around designing things and delivering on those design ideas, which I've always been. I'm not somebody who likes just doing academic work that other academics read. I like being involved in things that are about doing things in the world, solving problems, creating new opportunities. Very unfashionable in the academic context and not very kindly looked upon. But I thought when I was given tenure, it was an invitation to make a choice. And I thought that was a valuable thing to do.
Great.
So,